Good evening and welcome to the 2017 Public Lecture Series on the Wisconsin Idea Past and Present. The lecture series is part of a course being taught through the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am Professor Eric Sandrin, faculty member of the School of Veterinary Medicine, and I have the honor of being the instructor for the course this semester. Students, I will remind you to sign in. The Wisconsin Idea has always been about work and training students for the workforce. It meant, as Edgar Stevenson once put it, a faith in the application of intelligence and reason to the problem of society. The aspiration to light the way of Wisconsin citizens and government with the best torches of knowledge and understanding that their university can provide. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Don. Accordingly, the lecture series and the associated course aim to bring students, staff, and faculty in the UW system into a broad conversation with the citizens of the state about how the knowledge produced at the University of Wisconsin has benefited the public in the past and continues to do so today. I encourage you to participate actively through our course website, www.wiscidea.com. The Sociology Department is offering this course with limited resources. If you would like to contribute to the project, please consider making a contribution to the Course Foundation account. You can do so through the course website. We are fortunate to continue our series tonight with a lecture by Maryo, Gard, Ewell. Maryo currently is a Director of Community Impact for the Community Foundation of Gunnison Valley in Colorado and is President of the Robert E. Gard Foundation. She has MAs in Urban Planning from the University of Colorado at Denver and Organizational Behavior from Yale University. She's written extensively and speaks on many topics in community arts development and in fact has worked in the field of community arts development since her first summer job in 1967, working for the Office of Community Arts Development in the College of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her honors, among many, include 2017 Colorado Governor's Award for Creative Leadership, Americans for the Arts Selena Roberts Odom Award for Community Arts Leadership, and an Arts Education Advocate Award given by Think 360. I have a personal reason for looking forward to this presentation tonight. As for many of you, my children dragged me into many of the things that I've experienced in my life, including community theater. And I have a recurring stress dream where I have foolishly agreed to take a part in a play. The play now is to be offered in the morning or the next day, but I've forgotten to learn the lines. And I'm hoping she'll be able to provide some insight into the basis for this particular experience that I have, and that maybe some of you have as well. So like all of our speakers, she's graciously donating her time and expertise free of charge out of a commitment to the public service. Please join me in welcoming Maryo, Gard, Ewell.
The answer is improv, deep breathing, and maybe a glass of beer. Here's one of the really weird things about being here tonight, and thanks so much for having me. So, on this site, the footprint of this building was Wisconsin High, which I and several members of the audience attended, and as I walked in tonight, a horrible memory struck me, and it had to do with being in home ec in the 9th grade and baking possibly the world's most horrible pineapple upside down cake, which was thrown out the 3rd-story window by my classmates as a result. And so if today you walk up Henry Mall and find a place where the grass isn't growing, that's the remainder of the pineapple upside down cake, I'm afraid. So sorry about that. A couple of preliminaries. First, I want to thank in advance 2 amazing people. Maybe you'll want to talk to them afterwards too, who are helping me out tonight. Gail Lamberty of Roxbury, who is super knowledgeable about the La Follettes, particularly Belle Case La Follette, and George Sugros, who's the executive director of the Wisconsin Arts Board. So please direct all questions to them after this. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is some vocabulary. There are three entities that go by different names now, but I'm going to be using the names that they were called during most of the 20th century, which is really where my talk is grounded. One is the University of Wisconsin, not UW-Madison. One is WHA Radio, not W Public Radio, and one is the College of Agriculture rather than Agriculture and Life Sciences. So on to the story. So my dad's name was Robert E. Gard. He was a theater artist and a writer, and his 35 years on the University of Wisconsin faculty were completely and probably even obsessively devoted to public service in the framework of the Wisconsin idea. In his office in our basement, he had a photograph of Robert M. La Follette fighting Bob above his desk. I didn't get it. He was a theater guy. Why wasn't it Shakespeare? He was never home. He and his colleagues, they called themselves the Knights of the Wisconsin Idea, were out assisting people all over Wisconsin to make art and build community institutions. As a kid, I thought that was kind of cool, but I thought, was it real art? And what did it have to do with real life? It wasn't until after my dad's death in 1992, when I was going through his papers, that I realized I'd been 100% wrong. All their work was more than relevant to real life. It was utterly foundational to the development of democracy. Everyone in this room, I know, knows about Robert M. La Follette, governor, and Charles Van Hise, UW president, and Charles McCarthy of the Legislative Reference Bureau, who coined the term Wisconsin Idea. In Gwen's lecture last month, she captured something really important when she asked, is Wisconsin Idea simply a brand? No, she said it's a framework, a process, a set of values, a way of thinking. Here's what I'm meaning by the term tonight. Those early proponents of the Wisconsin Idea sought to make Wisconsin the crucible where democracy would come into its own. For this to happen, the people of Wisconsin needed to be comfortable in the world of ideas, the world of discussion, independent, critical, creative thinking. So that was the long-term end, a vibrant, forward-looking democracy of thinking people. And there were two intertwined short-term outcome areas in my mind. First, that the newest ideas in all fields of study should directly serve Wisconsin communities. And second, that the university would serve all of the state's individuals. In 1901, Governor La Follette said this:
"The state will not have fulfilled its duty to the university, nor the university fulfilled its mission to the people until adequate means have been furnished to every young man and woman to acquire an education at home and in every department of learning."
Van Hise stated it even more strongly.
The greatest waste in our nation is not economic, but rather the waste of human talent.
Van Hise was a geologist, not especially known as an art supporter, but still he said this:
I would have no mute, inglorious Milton in this state. I would have everybody who has a talent have an opportunity to find his way so far as his talent will carry him. And that is only possible through university extension supplementing the schools and the colleges.
And the means to that end was outreach, service, the presence of university faculty members in every hamlet in the state, the presence of educators on the radio and the television waves. In distinguished service, a sesquicentennial publication about the university's statewide endeavors, author Dean Emeritus Summerson showcases Extension's work in the arts as the very first chapter of the book, saying this:
University of Wisconsin professors with vision and energy partnered with community leaders and artists around the state and institutionalized the idea that the arts are for everyone. This was the university at its best. It was a shining example of the Wisconsin idea.
So, if the arts programs are the shining example of the Wisconsin idea in action, let's take a look. In 1910, student play production was not considered valid educational activity, but Professor Thomas Dickinson of the English department had this revolutionary notion that his students should write and produce plays. This was not allowed on campus, and thus was born the Wisconsin Dramatic Society. Dickinson worked with a woman in Milwaukee named Laura Sherry, whose philosophy with her Wisconsin Players Company was the same. The theater shouldn't be owned by New York professionals, but should be owned locally by non-professionals in their own communities. The Wisconsin Dramatic Society sought plays by Wisconsin writers, and among the people, by the way, who emerged from this so-called insurgent theater, that's what it was called, was the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Zona Gale from Portage. So how does this all relate to the Wisconsin idea? Well, remember the two outcome areas I mentioned? It certainly developed the latent talents of Wisconsin people, and by challenging the established notion that theater was owned by New York, Dickinson and his colleagues were bringing a new idea of the theater to Wisconsin communities. And remember the big end of the Wisconsin idea that people were being prepared to participate in a true democracy? Reflecting on the Wisconsin Dramatic Society 40 years after its founding in 1955, Professor Dickinson said this:
"There is absolutely no question of the organic association of the spirit of our work with La Follette progressivism. My chief interest was in the outworking of democracy, of which I considered the theater the workshop."
One observer noticed that his theater work was an intellectual insurgency when he stated, at the time, creating plays of, by, and for the community being a political act. Another playwright, Percy McKay, wrote in 1912 that
the Wisconsin idea involves the full scope of popular self-government. And popular self-government without indigenous art forms is incapable of civilized expression.
And Zona Gale herself said this:
"Whatever one may feel about the ultimate effect of democracy on art, democracy, when it comes, is going to have its art. The art of democracy will intensify democracy."
At the same time, Extension's Community Theater Department Director Ethel Rockwell directed a pageant in Sauk City in 1914, attended by 4,000 people. They put on special trains from Madison and Portage. The pageant was described by the reporter from Harper's Magazine, who came out from New York to see it, as richly significant as the rifle shot at Concord or the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The script for this 1914 A Social Center pageant said this on the cover:
The pageant signalized the perception that the government is no longer merely the selection of agents for repression, but is all-inclusive and living fellowship of all citizens in a creative process of self-education.
The theme of the pageant dealt with finding common ground so that citizens could strengthen their democracy. At the end of the play, participants removed the community's ballot box from town hall and led a procession of all of the participants in the audience to the schoolhouse where the ballot box was installed, so that, as a writer said in 2005, both symbolically and in fact, the school would be, quote, the seat of continual learning and open inquiry. Both the Rural Sociology Department and the Extension Service championed this new local drama idea, and the university's Lyceum Bureau and the Bureau of Dramatic Activities loaned scripts and offered help in playwriting, acting, producing plays, often for county fairs, and the speech department typically provided judges for these shows. And we're not just talking about the theater. One of the great names in this story in its early years was Edgar Gordon, Pop Gordon. He'd gotten his earliest job at the Chicago Commons Settlement House, a satellite of Jane Addams' famous Hull House in Chicago, where he discovered the power of the arts as he worked with the city's immigrant poor and the disenfranchised. He completely believed what Jane Addams did.
The arts are a potent agent for making the universal appeal and inducing men to forget their differences.
He became a music educator in his hometown of Winfield, Kansas, which won an award as the best Kansas community in which to raise a child. And judges cited as one of the elements of their award the degree to which the arts were integrated into the life of the community. University of Wisconsin Extension invited Gordon to come to Wisconsin to describe how he'd helped achieve that, and as a result, he was hired as the director of the Bureau of Community Music. Now, Professor Earl Terry of the physics department was working with what became WHA Radio, and he contacted W.H. Leidy of the Extension Division to explore how WHA could be of greater service to the people of Wisconsin beyond only offering the weather and the agricultural reports. Terry and Leidy asked Bob Gordon to take to the air, which he did in 1921. His weekly broadcast shared good music, and he explained why the music was considered good. But then he got the idea that he could actually use radio to teach people to participate in music making, and he pioneered the use of radio as a participatory medium, not just a passive, one-way medium. On July 4th, 1922, he invited his listeners to stand up in their living rooms, they were all wearing headsets now, and sing America the Beautiful together. Can you imagine it? All of those Wisconsin families standing up in their living rooms and singing together in what he called a great unseen chorus. Ultimately, he offered a program for school children, first called Let's Sing, and then called Journeys in Music Land, on WHA from 1931 to 1955. And he devised a method for teaching classroom singing via the radio, and I should say not just classroom singing. He apparently conducted a joint Madison-Viroqua joint choir via the radio. Can't imagine it. The class was incredibly popular with teachers and students. In 1931, there were 793 kids enrolled. By 1955, there were 70,000. He had two musical thrusts. Yes, teaching the so-called great classics, but also music and song from the ethnic cultural traditions of Wisconsin at that time, from Norway to Mexico, Germany to Czechoslovakia. But Gordon remembered his work at the Settlement House in Chicago too, and he knew the importance of people singing together in the flesh as well as virtually. And now, of course, some of you probably know we've got all sorts of data to prove what he knew, that there is quite literally a health benefit for people who sing together that singing alone does not achieve. WHA sponsored festivals in which kids from all over Wisconsin came to campus to sing. In 1934, 300 children came to Music Hall. Then the numbers of kids swelled, and they had to move the festival to the Stock Pavilion. And then it swelled even more, and they moved it to the Field House. And then even the Field House, which was the largest venue on campus, was too small. So they were forced to split the festival into 15 regional festivals across the state. And by its last year, there were 22,300 kids singing together in festivals that he directed. Gordon crisscrossed Wisconsin by train, helping form singing societies in person as well. Once again, the aim was sociological as well as aesthetic. He said this:
I see in community music and drama a means of combating juvenile delinquency and family degeneration.
He thought music could be useful in helping a community move towards resolving conflict and creating a setting for conversation. So in De Pere, for example, which was experiencing religious conflict at the time, he helped form an ecumenical group that sang in a Presbyterian church under the direction of a Catholic priest, something as revolutionary in its time as the work of the Wisconsin Dramatic Society had been. You may remember in her first lecture, Gwen Drury cited a book from 1912 by Frederick Howe called Wisconsin, An Experiment in Democracy. Howe noted that the service ethic of the university's educators was the key to making it all work.
Wisconsin has bred a spirit of service that is unique. There is nothing like it in America. It suggests the existence of an instinct for public work that we have rarely offered an opportunity to develop.
And there you have it, those nights. Gordon exemplified this drive for service. Indeed, he never accepted compensation for any of his work on the radio. The College of Agriculture was in a particularly fine position to serve rural Wisconsin, of course. Chris Christensen was the dean at the college from 1930 to 1943, and he believed that the Danish folk school movement, blending cultural learning for farmers with agricultural learning, dovetailed nicely with the Wisconsin idea. So what the heck was the Danish folk school? It goes back to a fellow named Nikolai Grundtvig, a Danish poet and bishop. In 1832, he appealed to the common man and woman to think independently on relevant social, spiritual, and cultural and national issues, and he encouraged them to become acquainted with their cultural background, with Danish heritage, in order to live fuller lives. His folk schools, intended for people from all classes, taught home economics, agricultural methods, history, literature, Danish mythology, and a lot more. The teaching method was intended to simultaneously, quote, enlighten students and encourage them to engage in their own thought and discussions and forge a new social and political consciousness, and also a rhetoric to express it that could accommodate both the old agrarian values and virtues as well as their newly found economic power. Something I find really interesting is that, you know how in a lot of languages there's a formal and an informal word for the word you, like in French it's vous and tu, and in German it's sie and du. Well, the folk school proponents advocated just using the informal du, thus getting rid of what they saw as false class dichotomies. So a political, social, cultural, even linguistic approach. In a history of the folk school, Irish poet economist George Russell is quoted as saying this:
"A nation is cultivated only so far as the average man is cultivated and has knowledge of the thought, imagination, and intellectual history of his nation. Governments do not build up civilizations. That is done by the citizens using the creative imagination about life, trying to make the external correspond to something in the spirit."
Dean Chris thought that the College of Agriculture could be a Wisconsin folk school. He explicitly felt that education in our agricultural colleges must be broad and must include good literature, art, history, the cultural side of life, as well as practical training for better farming. He said this:
In emphasizing the social or cultural values arising out of the improved economic conditions, it is well to keep clearly in mind that this will come about only if the economic process operates in some kind of cultural framework. The achievement of wealth itself contains no guarantee that it will become the means to more significant living. As a matter of fact, wealth in careless hands may be a two-edged sword, wielding destruction to its owner and to society.
Dean Chris hired John Barton into the Department of Rural Sociology, and he and Barton conceived the notion to have a visual artist on the staff of the College of Agriculture. The artist would help people reflect on their own culture of agriculture, again, like the Wisconsin Dramatic Society, expanding the notion of art from being the purview of the established great artists to include people making art in their own communities, that insurgent idea. Barton said this:
It was in a country tavern in Portage County which first gave public recognition to a young Polish painter for a series of native landscape murals. And the tavern keeper said it was good business. If it's good business for the tavern, it could also be good business for the local library, school, or community house. If the work is competent, it would seem more appropriate to recognize native talent than trying to hang a conventional print of 3 horses' heads, a blind muse playing a harp, or some other worn-out picture from a bygone era.
But consistent with the beginnings of the Wisconsin idea, the artist in residence idea was interlinked with the notion of American democracy. John Barton again.
The rural art movement cannot properly be understood apart from the democratic movement. It was inevitable that the democratic revolution, still in process through universal education and today adult education, should call into being, among others, a rural people's art.
This would be revolutionary today, and this was 1936. The country's first artist in residence, not in an art department, and linked to the idea of democracy, not just art history and theory. So where to get this extraordinary person who'd be an excellent artist, who understood the rural scene, and who could inspire ordinary people to paint the world as they personally saw it? Christensen knew Grant Wood, and he visited him in Iowa to float the idea. Wood liked it and suggested John Stuart Curry of Kansas. There are a lot of Kansans in this story, who was at the time working in Connecticut, who would be just the person, given his rural background and his own populist ideals. The dean hopped the train to Connecticut and broached the idea to Curry. He'd have no teaching responsibilities. Just as researchers work in their labs to advance knowledge, so would Curry work in his studio to advance creative thinking. The university president at the time, Glenn Frank, explicitly believed in this idea, and he said this:
"There is poetry as well as production on the farm. Art can help us to preserve the poetry of farming while we are battling with the economics of farming."
In announcing Curry's appointment in 1936, President Frank said this:
"In launching this new educational venture, we are undertaking to give emphasis to regional art as a force for rural as well as urban culture in the Middle West."
Remember I said earlier that the significance of the Wisconsin Dramatic Society was that people locally started writing and producing their own plays? In 1931, Frank had had this idea.
"The next great dramatic renaissance in America will come when the theater is recaptured from the producers by the people."
Frank clearly saw how the arts related to the Wisconsin idea by empowering local people to think creatively for themselves. Curry started traveling, and everywhere he went, he discovered farmers and members of their families who wanted to make art. He saw art in the hills, the farms, the farmers, the air, the animals, the earth of Wisconsin, and he believed that everyone has the ability to paint what is most alive to him. It was just a matter of enabling people to do so. He emphasized personal vision over technique. As a result, paintings by farmers who worked with Curry are dramatic, breathtakingly alive. And over there, I've got a book that was published in 1948 with some of those images. Curry said this:
"The feeling inherent in the life of the world cannot be ignored or trifled with for the sake of theory."
Which doesn't mean that he blew off art theory and the deep learning of technique, but the purpose of those was to go beyond. Curry said this:
"I do not despise the classic and accepted forms of our civilization, but it is time that people realize that they have a more magnificent life to use and to view in our creative efforts. If you feel the significance of life, the design builds itself."
He envisioned a statewide exhibit of art by farm family members, and the first exhibit was held in 1940 at the Memorial Union with 30 artists from 17 counties participating. Next, it included a junior show with 28 kids the first year. By 1946, only 6 years later, there were 101 artists exhibiting. Curry offered personal critique of each of the pieces. Local art clubs started forming around the state. The Rural Rembrandts of Watoma was the first one. And their local shows led to regional shows which connected with the state show. The independent Wisconsin Regional Artists Association was ultimately formed, working closely with and complementing the university's program. For the Wisconsin Centennial in 1948, the Department of Rural Sociology produced the book I mentioned, showcasing what artists working with Curry had produced. Aaron Borod was Curry's successor as artist in residence, and his work was complemented by that of Jim Schwalbach, whose title initially was Extension Specialist in Rural Art. Schwalbach traveled the state constantly, working closely with the local artists. But like Pop Gordon, he also took to the airwaves. As I look at this audience, there are some of us of a certain age. Fess up, how many of you remember hearing Mr. Schwalbach's voice in your classroom teaching art? Anybody? Yeah? Yeah, there are people here. He broadcast Let's Draw over WHA from 1936 to 1970 into the schools of Wisconsin. Here's a snippet from Wisconsin on the Air by Jack Mitchell.
Perhaps the most surprising use of radio was the Let's Draw series, which taught visual art without visuals. James Schwalbach tapped into students' imaginations to inspire them to create their own art rather than copying what the teacher showed them. In the spring of 1939, for example, he had a unit on capturing feelings in pictures. The feeling of coldness, for example, and the feeling of love. Abstract concepts more challenging to convey in pictures than a house or a tree.
I remember my teachers at Edgewood Elementary tuning in Let's Draw. We'd listen to instruction for a few minutes and then we'd begin painting or drawing, typically to music. I remember being invited to paint whatever Smetana's orchestral The Moldau made me feel. We were urged to paint our own ideas just as Curry had urged his students to do. Indeed, Schwalbach thought TV would be a great thing when it came along because it was so visual, of course. But he went on the air and taught Let's Draw for just 9 sessions before he canceled out on it because he realized that students with television would just copy what they saw on the screen, copy what he was doing rather than thinking for themselves, which he felt was the antithesis of investigating your personal creativity. So he went back to the radio for the next 20 years. Schwalbach went to Scandinavia to study the home crafts movement there. He returned feeling that such a movement could be undertaken in Wisconsin too. His colleague Tom Eckner recalls the formation of the Wisconsin Association of Crafts. They worked with county extension agents on a bold program for improving the economic well-being of rural people as well as the beauty of American homes. They'd asked the extension agent to identify underemployed or unemployed people with creative ideas who might be able to design stuff in their counties, stuff like puzzles or salt and pepper shakers. Schwalbach was in contact with firms that manufactured these items and marketplaces nationwide to sell them. So for a time, Extension was directly helping rural craftspeople to make a living. Schwalbach believed it was essential to eliminate what he called the archaic distinction between the so-called fine and amateur artists, to resolve the unnecessary breach between amateur and professional, and to recognize multiple standards. Again, we're going back to the Wisconsin Dramatic Society there. This would not be trifling with standards of excellence, but would be building a whole new kind of art. This would spawn a new kind of artist with a new role in society. He said this:
"The community needs the artist, but an artist who accepts some responsibility towards the community, an artist who can hold forth a vision of the future that is built on the past."
And then there was my dad, Robert E. Gard. Visual arts idea, music ideas were working well. What about creative writing? Gard was a Kansan, a kid born on a dairy farm in 1910. He was proud of his skill at milking cows, and he liked writing poetry and stories in high school. Ultimately, he went to the University of Kansas, where he got a part-time job as a stagehand in the university theater. He was hooked. He went to grad school and studied at Cornell with a fellow named Alexander Drummond, who was a curiously bifurcated character, one of the luminaries of the American theater at the time. But since Cornell was a land-grant university, which we're going to hear more about, I believe, in the lecture next week, and Gwen mentioned it in her first lecture, he also believed that he had a direct responsibility to the folks of upstate New York. Drummond was disgusted with the plays that were considered suitable for rural production by the Samuel French playlist out of New York, feeling that list reflected plays that were trivial, disrespectful, and denigrating to rural people. And he felt that plays written by people about their own lives would be the answer. Gard was intrigued, and together they developed a New York State Plays Project where farm family members were encouraged to conceive, write, and produce their own plays with the help of Cornell University. Gard brought these ideas to Wisconsin in 1945. Calling his office the Wisconsin Idea Theater, he began to articulate the notion that together, professional artists, skilled facilitator teachers, and everyman could make the promise of America real and meaningful to everyone.
There must be plays that grow from all the countrysides of America, fabricated by the people themselves, born of their happiness and sorrow, born of toiling hands and free minds, born of music and love and reason.
In 1948, Gard taught a workshop in writing for 4-H leaders. He quotes one of the participants at the end of this 3-day workshop, saying this:
"If the people of Wisconsin knew that someone would encourage them to express themselves in any way they chose, if they knew that someone would back them and help them when they wanted help, there would be such a rising of creative expression as is yet unheard of in Wisconsin, for the whole expression would be of and about ourselves."
Pretty amazing, huh? From this moment in 1948 came his idea for the Wisconsin Rural, later Regional Writers Association, and thousands of aspiring writers joined right away. Like Curry, Gard offered help to anyone.
I had a hunch that quite a few folks would respond to the rural writers idea. To the horror of my already overburdened small staff, over 1,000 poems were sent in a few days' time. There were short stories too, and a few plays. The curious thing was that the material, for the most part, was quite above average.
Gard also began to see the arts as a way of morphing hard community conversations from dysfunctional bickering to proactive community building while creating a new kind of art at the same time. Here's a story I really enjoy along those lines. Gard had been invited to a farmers' meeting in 1950. First on the agenda was a discussion of a law just passed that the farmers hated that required them to install concrete floors in the milk houses. Gard would then talk about starting a community theater.
This particular meeting turned into a hot one. The chair got into trouble trying to keep order, and the county agricultural agent was almost mobbed because of some of the folks blamed him for their plight. This community had also summoned its state assemblyman to be present. He had voted for the milk house bill. They said violent things to him. They wrangled for a while and then decided to call it off. They turned the meeting over to me. I was in an uncomfortable spot, faced by the probable futility of trying to stimulate interesting discussion in this particular atmosphere. It suddenly occurred to me that the previous discussion had aspects of drama, conflict, character, excellent dialogue. So I set about fabricating a comic situation, and before we realized it, a kind of group play was in progress. Only now it seemed in terms of comedy, for I had attempted to exaggerate the purpose on both sides and to enlarge on the innocence of the county agent, and to exaggerate the well-meaning, slightly self-pitying attitude of the legislator, as well as the anger of several of the more outspoken opponents of the Milk House bill. In the informally dramatized version of the affair that we made up, the farmer was getting his whacks at the legislator, and the county agent was making his excuses, but now within the framework of a creative situation.
The Wisconsin Idea had tentacles everywhere. Gard collected Wisconsin stories, turned them into radio dramas, had a standing program on WHA radio and television. His graduate students studied questions like, Why do people participate in the arts? Working closely, in fact, with the sociology department on this, and they worked across departments to try to understand that question better. And of course, everybody associated with the Wisconsin Idea Theater helped people produce their own art statewide and learn about themselves in the process. His graduate student, Marjorie Harbaugh, in the mid-1950s, a folk singer, was given a state car, a year's salary, and a mandate to get out of town and perform for every school, every church, every community center that she could find in Wisconsin so that people could understand and value their own history. In 1963, Gard met David Peterson, who was a teacher at Monona Grove High School, who wanted to write musicals based on Wisconsin history and stories, and he joined Gard's Wisconsin Idea Theater staff, creating shows that toured to county fairs, cities, towns, and state parks for nearly 30 years. A quick aside, I had just gotten my driver's license. I was a groupie to that theater for one summer. And Miss Allison Dairyland, of course, also came to county fairs to talk about butter and cheese. And that particular year, Miss Alice didn't have a driver's license, so it was my job to meet her at the Greyhound bus and escort her to the show. I learned a lot about butter that year, and I think she learned a lot about Wisconsin history. In 1965, the National Endowment for the Arts had been created by Congress. Gard, whose office was now called the Office of Community Arts Development in the College of Agriculture, figured that since the NEA was supported by the people's tax dollars, it would surely respond to a proposal that would be arts of, by, and for the people. They'd choose 5 towns in Wisconsin, each with fewer than 10,000 people. For the next 3 years, they'd work on 3 things. First, they'd provide access to touring arts and fine professional arts experiences to people right there at home. Remember, we're talking 1965. No interstate highways for the most part, few community arts centers, no HBO, no internet. Second, the team would facilitate opportunities for people to experience and explore art for themselves in classes and workshops. And finally, they would help people form a local arts group to continue the work after the 3-year grant period was over. What was significant was that the power would be in the hands of the people in these communities to decide what was right for their own community. The proposal was deeply rooted in Wisconsin Idea values, and they said this in the proposal.
In terms of American democracy, the arts are for everyone. As America emerges into different understanding of her strength, it becomes clear that her strength is in the people and in the places and where the people live. The people, if shown the way, can create art in and of themselves.
How democratic, yes? So worthy of federal funding, therefore, yes? Well, not so easy. From a history of the NEA, staff member Charles Christopher Mark observed that in its first year, the National Council's focus had been on major institutions such as the American Ballet or the Metropolitan Opera. The National Council, which included many of the arts luminaries at the time, like architect I.M. Pei or choreographer Agnes DeMille, Leonard Bernstein, and others, they figured that the fledgling state arts councils, of which George is now the executive director, would take care of rural America. They didn't have to. So when the proposal from Wisconsin came before them, Mark described it like this.
The reaction was completely negative. Some of the council members were amused that we should even propose to spend $58,000 a year for 3 years for such a project.
It was clear that the project would be voted down. The discussion was heated, and Chairman Roger Stevens called a lunch break to calm people down. Leonard Bernstein had missed the morning session, but he arrived quickly during the break. Charles Mark again.
When I told him the Rural Arts Project had been tabled, he told me that was one reason why he wanted to come to the meeting. I thought he was another negative vote, but he said he read the full proposal and he thought it important. When the session resumed, Bernstein raised his hand to speak. After a dramatic pause, he said, This project has everything to do with why we are sitting here. In short, this man who represented art in its highest form was an unexpected and effective ally of Bob Gard's concept of developing the inherent need for a creative outlook in all people. When he finished, the attitude of the council had been reversed and the project was passed unanimously.
The final report to the NEA, quote, charts the saga of citizens of 5 small communities in Wisconsin who were stirred to action in ways they had never imagined. The story is an exciting one, full of hope, full of action, full of dreams, unquote. Encouraging, quote again, the articulate neighborly sharing of excellence in art, surfaced local leaders with great dreams. The final report was the book that we have copies of over there, The Arts in the Small Community, A National Plan. 40,000 copies were distributed across America, and rural arts councils everywhere began springing up in the Wisconsin model. In 1973, I worked for a year as secretary to Emmett Serig, who was chair of the Extension Arts Department at the time. The number of artists in all disciplines in the merged department had grown to 28 by then. They were based in Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Shell Lake, up in the northwestern part of the state. The preface to the 1977-8 annual report of arts development begins like this.
Perhaps more than any other state, Wisconsin has been concerned with university-citizen relationships in the arts through university extension.
So what were they doing? In addition to speeches and workshops and one-on-one work with the people, here are some of the programs that they were doing during the 1970s and 80s to bring university and the people of the state into closer proximity within the framework of the Wisconsin idea. Helen O'Brien, Nearly Blind, crisscrossed Wisconsin by Greyhound bus, working with youth drama programs, especially within 4-H, in 72 different counties in a single year. Ed Hugdahl created a program to help rural organists improve and develop their music and performance. Marvin Rabin created a program to ensure that Norwegian folk fiddling would be kept alive and flourishing in Wisconsin, and he also developed a music program for inner city Milwaukee youth. Here we hearken back to Pop Gordon, James Adams, and Hull House. And this led to the Inner City Heritage Symphony and the Jazz Ensemble in inner city Milwaukee. Rabin and Dick Wolf, working with kids, built the statewide youth symphony, the junior youth symphony, the concert orchestra, and their Symphonietta Strings Group. Band camps drew thousands of kids to Camp Randall, and the music theater program for kids likewise was popular. The Music Educators Conference broke a few molds when they put rock and roll musicians on the faculty to ensure that music teachers stayed in touch with the interests of their students. Karen Cowan urged people to dance and create choreography, and there were dance workshops everywhere in Wisconsin. Harv Thompson helped raise standards in high school drama, and continuing Gard's tradition documented direct service in a single year to more than 100 community theaters. Dave Peterson wrote and directed touring musicals, bringing Wisconsin history to life at county fairs and in state parks, as well as traditional arts venues. Records show that in the late 1960s, they performed to over 50,000 Wisconsin people in a single 3-year period, as well as producing big musicals in the Camp Randall football field. Imagine that. In the visual arts were Ken Coomerline, Leslie Nelson, Joe Bradley in Madison, Jim Schneller and Tom Eckner in Milwaukee, and so many more, continuing John Stewart Curry's regional art program, facilitating 12 regional art shows, culminating in a big state art show. Going strong today. In fact, the big show was last weekend in Wausau. And like Schwalbach, they developed art pedagogy tools for elementary art teachers. Arts and Society magazine, I've got a sample over there, addressed contemporary issues. There were writing and art classes in the university's short course for farmers and classes for College Week for women. They helped build institutions, the Council for Wisconsin Writers, the Wisconsin Fellowship of Poets, the Midwest Playwrights Lab, the Wisconsin Dance Council, the Wisconsin Theater Association and Convention. Yarns of Yesteryear, Arts for the Elderly, and a special theater program served senior citizens. The Arts and Human Needs program provided leadership training. There were special Native American music and dance programs and a Native Voices Writers Conference. The Wisconsin Women in the Arts program was being developed. I know many of you know the name of Catherine Clarenbach, one of the great women's rights champions on this campus, and she and Gard were close friends and developed programs together. There was a Hispanic cultural videotapes program to address Mexican immigrant experience, especially in Milwaukee. Robert Gard continued to work tirelessly collecting Wisconsin stories, traveling everywhere to teach and inspire people to write. The Wisconsin Regional Writers Program boasted over 2,000 members from every county in the state. He developed and managed the School of the Arts at Rhinelander. He wrote scripts for the annual Milwaukee Folk Festival that continues to this day, celebrating the cultural heritage of the groups of Wisconsin. Even after his retirement, Gard and some colleagues produced an art exhibit of Southeast Asian refugees, Wisconsin's newest immigrant group at the time. And remember, it was all about creativity in the service of building a mature, democratic America. Gard wrote the creed of the Wisconsin Regional Writers Association, and it states this:
Let us believe in ourselves and our talents. Let us believe in the worth of the individual and seek to understand him, for from sympathy and understanding will our writings grow. Let us believe that the democratic process of government is safest in the hands of a cultured, enlightened people.
Things change, of course. Arts extension, as it was then, is no more, though there are art classes within continuing studies. Ironically, continuing studies Dean Jeff Russell wrote an op-ed piece in March of this year in which he reflected on political science author Kathy Kramer's book about the political urban-rural divide in Wisconsin. He said that Ms. Kramer visited many Wisconsin communities to gather her information, and then he said,
People thank Kramer for showing up, showing respect, and listening. Most residents could not recall meeting someone else from UW-Madison.
The last people who experienced Let's Sing or Let's Draw are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s now. Memories fade quickly, and Kathy Kramer's observations are real and terribly ironic. Yes, things change, but I believe that big ideas are constant. Here are, to me, the ideas I hope I've left with you. That the values of arts extension included respect for all people. A belief that all have ideas worth expressing. That people have latent talent that simply needs to be uncovered and nurtured. That community life can be made more meaningful through the arts. That one-way virtual learning is important, but that bringing people together physically is also vital. That people can make their own art and express their own cultural values, and that a whole new kind of contemporary art, as well as meaningful community service, emerges accordingly. And what's it all about? That long-term end. Democracy arising out of curiosity, critical thinking, the embracing of new ideas. The short-term outcomes, ideas and university-developed products in every community in the state, and everyone discovering his or her special talent. And the medium, direct service by passionate faculty members who had one-to-one relationships with individuals, families, and groups in their own communities and were omnipresent across the state. I mentioned I'm putting a few books out there that you might want to noodle through after the class is over. I've got a handout indicating which ones are still available in print or online. And I should also mention, how many of you know about the Gard Storytellers Circle on Observatory Drive? Well, go thee and discover it. It's the most wonderful place. The university dedicated it in 2010. It's on Muir Knoll, right above Helen C. White Hall, across from the education building, right at that big switchback on Observatory Drive where everybody has to downshift. Incised on the floor of the circle are Gard's words, "The Wisconsin idea, expansive minds, and star-aspiring ideals." A plaque describes Gard's belief that everyone has a story, and you're invited into the story, into the circle, to contemplate quietly or share a story, or learning with others. I wonder perhaps if your Thursday discussion group for this class, maybe this Thursday, which I know is held in social science, could just move next door about 100 feet and meet in the storyteller's circle. Perhaps we'll do that. We'll find that out after class. Even if we don't, I urge you to visit. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place of contemplation and learning. Well, as we try to figure out what the Wisconsin idea means in the 21st century, we walk with Governor La Follette and President Van Hise, Pop Gordon, Ethel Rockwell, Robert Gard, John Stewart Curry, Zona Gale, Dean Christensen, John Barton, and so many, many more. What do you think are the big ideas from these stories that are relevant to the next generation? And how can you transmit them? I'd like to close with the words of Gard, who in 1969 ended the arts in the small community this way. If you try, what may you expect?
First, a community, welded through art to a new consciousness of self.
A new being, perhaps a new appearance.
A people proud of achievements which lift them through the creative, above the ordinary.
A new opportunity for children to find exciting experiences in art and to carry this excitement on throughout their lives.
A meeting of peoples and backgrounds through art.
A new view of hope for mankind and an elevation of man, not degradation.
New values for individual and community life.
And a sense that here, in our place, we are contributing to the maturity of a great nation.
If you try, you can indeed alter the face and the heart of America. Thank you.
The only reason I dare interrupt the applause is because we'll have an opportunity to do that again. Thank you for your outstanding presentation, and I will open the floor to questions.
Of them.
Well, we're all shy people in Wisconsin, and you may not have had your powder milk biscuits, so I'll ask the first question. You refer to Kathy Kramer's work and her comments that the people she visited were surprised to see anybody from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And yet you also commented about how certain of the initiatives, maybe in a different form, still persist: musical, theater, arts. How would you characterize the state of the state of the connection now between UW-Madison and the rest of the state of Wisconsin with respect to the arts? What are the things that have been lost, maybe? And what are the things we should perhaps most try to bring back, in your perspective?
Here's where I say, well, I'm not from Wisconsin anymore, but that's only an excuse. You know, I think we all know that there are things that we just take for granted. You know, where organizations that we belong to come from isn't something that many of us really think about that much. But I think it's really important to remember that many of these institutions, most of them, all of them, were formed on the basis of one-to-one relationships between university people and people, families, and nascent organizations, from churches to granges to farmers' organizations in their own communities. And when Dean Russell wrote the blog, which I thought was a really good one, he was asking, how can we build or rebuild an authentic relationship between university and people? So I would first say that it's all about the big vision. I mean, I think to me the important thing in this, the most important thing in this story is that there's a huge vision out there that creativity can lead to democracy, and that things like art classes and institutions are simply means to ends, not ends in themselves. So one thing I think is the relationship Another thing is the clarity of the vision. It's not just about teaching creative writing. It's not just about learning to paint, but it's writing and painting to a bigger end. I will, however, at this point, and one of the reasons that I asked George to be here is, as the executive director of the Wisconsin Arts Board, he's got a total handle on that question right now. In fact, I believe you were testifying in the legislature just today. And so maybe I could ask George to help answer that.
So yeah, I was, and it goes back to the notion of the origin story. So you're very lucky. You have the great historian Maryo here, who told you the story of the history of the arts at the UW and how it affected the state. But I guarantee you there are plenty of people out there that don't know the origin stories of the organizations Maryo was referencing. So the Regional Writers Association, I'm sure there are a number of people who are writing that are connected to that organization that don't know it flowed out of the UW. Same thing is true of the Regional Artists Association. The Wisconsin Arts Board itself flows out of all of this Wisconsin idea conversation. Our founding of Arts Wisconsin is the same, right? So the family tree of this work is huge and ongoing. So part of it is reminding people who are engaged with it where it comes from. And then secondarily, we can't look backwards and say, okay, those good old days, let's go back to that. But what about let's draw in a podcast way? That's a different way of delivering, but our people in this 21st century of ours think, oh, we were the first ones doing distance learning. They were doing distance learning over the radio, or they were doing distance learning by getting in a car and doing it right there in place. Now, the last thing I'll say is, we're lucky that the UW system is across the state, right? So if you go to River Falls, if you go to Stout, if you go to those places, you will find connections of those campuses. And I see Tom's hand up there. He wants to say something about all that.
As a UW-Platteville alum and somebody who works for UW Extension, I really appreciate that you just mentioned that, because I think this is one of the big changes in the lay of the land of Wisconsin and the Wisconsin idea since 1964 with Fred Harvey Harrington and splitting UW, the University of Wisconsin, as a coherent brand into three brands: UW Colleges, the two-year centers, UW Extension, including Wisconsin Public Broadcasting, which even at that time was Wisconsin Public Radio and Wisconsin Public Television, and then UW-Madison. And I would argue, and I have before, that UW-Madison was left as a rump. It became UW-Research. That's how we ought to look at that. So when people say to Kathy Kramer, wow, we haven't seen anybody here at the University of Wisconsin in a long time, would they have said that in 1963? Because in 1963, there was only one brand, and that was the 72 county offices. They were University of Wisconsin writ big people. The Ag Extension people reported to the dean right here at Ag Hall. They were part of what we could call today UW-Madison. All the credit that accrued to Wisconsin Public Radio or Wisconsin Public Television, if you asked, what has the University of Wisconsin done for me recently? You could say all that great stuff you're talking about on radio and television. And I think this is one of the things that we got to look both ways on, is that Fred Harvey Harrington splitting, I think, was a tragedy for UW-Madison because it was left as a rump. The great thing about mentioning UW system is that now you look at the map and you say, how far are people from university resources in this state? Not teacher colleges, not normal schools, but really full-fledged universities. And I'm very happy to be an alum of UW-Platteville, which goes back to 1866. I'm very happy that you mentioned that, because I think that's the kind of thing that we have an opportunity to look at. The Harry Knorr Gallery at Platteville is something that we need to think about in the terms of the Wisconsin idea and what it means for that region. You're the first person I've heard mention UW system, and I hope we continue to look at it that way, not just as a UW-Madison issue.
You cannot travel the state and not think of it that way. And we still get the opportunity to do that.
Hi, can you hear me? Just going off of what Tom just said, on the September 12th, the week that I did the talk, I have posted on that week's website an article by E. East Lawson that was written in 1910. And in 1910, he made the point that if you tried to cut off all these other things that the university did, you would have just a stump left. So when he said rump, I thought, I've heard that before, and it came from 1910. So this has been, the truth of that, I think, echoes back even a lot farther.
So if anybody wants to take a look, I'm not going to do all of this show and tell, but we do have a copy of Arts and Society here. The Rural Artist book is here. A really awesome book about the faculty's impact around the state for the sesquicentennial. Somebody did their master's thesis on Let's Draw, the pedagogical methods and how it was done. There's a report here about music programs in inner city Milwaukee, and just tons and tons and tons of other things.
Could you mention the Oral History Project?
I sure could, and I'm so glad you asked that. So I also have a list, as I mentioned, of the things that are available. And one of the really wonderful resources that the Gard Foundation and a number of emeritus faculty have done is tried to capture oral histories of some of these folks while they're still living. And so on the UW Oral History website out of Steenbach, and I know there's a librarian from Steenbach here, and so thank you. There are about 20 oral histories of some of these folks or some of their students. I had the pleasure of interviewing Marjorie Harbaugh, the folk singer, who was given the car, a salary, and told to get out of Dodge and perform everywhere. So there's some really wonderful stories there. And if you just Google Robert Gard oral history and Steenbach, you'll come up with it like that, and they're really wonderful digital recordings. Thanks, George.
Can I have the postcards and show them?
Oh, yeah. So in one of her other lives, Gail is Belcase La Follette, and if you have an event that you need Mrs. La Follette to appear at, there she is.
I brought something for you that's one of my favorite La Follette quotes. It speaks to what we're going through right now. Bob said, "We are slow to realize that democracy is a life and involves a continual struggle. So when the struggle gets you down a little bit, think about Bob and his struggle, and that we are the legacy of that struggle." There's one here for anybody who wants to take one. If Bob Gard could have a picture of Bob La Follette in his office, you could have a postcard of Bob La Follette too.
That's great.
Any more questions?
So what do you think about the idea of meeting at the Storytellers Circle, Eric? I don't know what the weather's going to be
Weather
like.
permitting, I think it's a wonderful idea, but I think we should meet in 6102 for those of you who are coming to the discussion session. And then if it's a nice day, we'll just take a quick walk over there.
And even if you can't go as a class, do stop by. I know parking is tricky up in that part of the campus, but the Storytellers Circle is really just an amazing place. So take a class, take friends, go with the book.
This is just an aside, kind of about what goes around comes around. James Watras gave Joe Bradley a chance to be a distance learner at the Extension Division. Joe Bradley, years later, moved to Oakwood Village University Woods on Mineral Point Road. I was fortunate enough to work with him as his art therapist for 10 years. And so he and Catherine moved into the tower. They lived there about 5 years. Unfortunately, she passed. He used his disability to his advantage and taught classes at Oakwood Village. So
Joe Bradley was almost completely paralyzed.
Joe Bradley, at age 23, had a brain tumor and was almost totally paralyzed at that time. And his father, who he called Pop, was a scientist at the University of Wisconsin, and didn't agree with the physical therapy programs in Wisconsin at the time, and sent his son to New York for physical therapy because he said, you are going to survive and you are going to pursue a career and you are going to do well. So he went from being an extraordinary still life artist to being an extraordinary abstract artist. And we had a father and daughter show with he and his daughter Peggy Timmerman rather. And it was just, when you mentioned Joe Bradley's name, my heart went, woo, because he was an extraordinary man in extension, and James Watrous was not only his mentor, but his dear friend.
Once again, figuring out amazing ways to teach, like radio, teaching live music. People did it. It's creative thinking, just in creating the tools of pedagogy as well as the expression.
And as we think about the challenges of today and the hope for the future, I wanted to bring forward and have Maryo comment on the fact that the Gard Foundation, which of course springs directly from this legacy, in partnership with the Arts Board, did a 50th anniversary summit about the arts in the small community last year. And the reason we did it is we sort of assumed, but we wanted to hear from other people, that the ideas of the Wisconsin idea, and specifically the ones that come from the arts, that it is about the individual and their creative expression, would resonate beyond Wisconsin's borders to new immigrant groups that are coming to the United States, Native Americans, and because this was a rural project in its beginning, that it would actually resonate in urban neighborhoods as well. Why don't you pick up the story from there and just speak to the...
You're telling it. Keep going.
All right, I'll tell it. I'll just finish it by saying we had leaders from around the nation come in. And again, those people benefited from the history that Maryo is able to provide, so they ground themselves, because people kind of make up stuff. You'll hear a lot of people talking about creative placemaking now. Well, creative placemaking comes out of this same place of community development in the arts, but that's ages old, because human beings are ages old. And so I just brought that forward because here we had people of every stripe, every age, every background coming to Wingspread in Racine to talk about these ideas and validating exactly what we knew they would. That because this springs from the human spirit, these ideas, this way of doing art, this way of connecting people and communities will carry on long, long, long down the road. And which is why people like Maryo and me and others who do this work get back up every day and go back out and do it again. Mm-hmm. Because we know all throughout this state and all throughout the country, and frankly all throughout the world, there are people who are doing this work to connect individuals and communities to each other.
The Wisconsin idea, expansive minds and star-aspiring ideals. Thank you all.